What if the pyramids were already ancient when Egypt itself was young? Not speculation, geology. Not theory, inscriptions. The stones record rainfall Egypt's pharaohs never knew, and the pharaohs themselves wrote that they did not build these monuments, they inherited them. The Sphinx enclosure displays vertical erosion grooves carved deep into bedrock, the signature of heavy rainfall. The Great Pyramid contains no hieroglyphs, no mummies, no inscriptions naming the dead. The inventory. Stella describes Khufu not as builder, but restorer of monuments already present at Giza. And beneath the surface, modern radar has revealed sealed voids and unexplored chambers that remain off-limits to this day. These are not fringe theories. They are documented observations that have circulated through academic journals for decades, raising a single persistent question. What if the timeline we've been taught is incomplete? Evening settles across the Giza plateau. The tour buses pull away, their engines fading into the distance. Vendors close their stalls. The last groups of travelers take their final photographs and depart. And in the stillness that follows, the monuments stop being attractions and become what they have always been, witnesses to something older than certainty. The three pyramids stand in precise alignment, their angles sharp against the dimming sky, their limestone surfaces glowing amber in the last light. The Sphinx crouches at the plateau's edge, its gaze fixed eastward, its body half buried by sand that has been excavated and returned countless times across millennia. The wind moves across ancient stone, the temperature drops. The shadows lengthen, and the desert remembers what the textbooks have simplified. For over a century, we have been taught a clear narrative. The pyramids were built during Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2580 BC. Pharaoh Khufu commissioned the Great Pyramid as his tomb, organizing tens of thousands of workers to quarry, transport, and assemble 2.3 million limestone blocks over the course of decades. His son Khafra raised the second pyramid and carved the Sphinx. Menkaura followed with the third. Together, these monuments represent the pinnacle of Old Kingdom Egypt, proof of centralized power, architectural mastery, and the pharaoh's obsession with eternal life. It is a story that makes sense. It fits neatly into dynastic chronology. It explains the monuments as products of their time, ambitious, yes, but achievable through human organization and determination. Museums display it, documentaries repeat it, guides recite it daily beneath the towering stones. And for most purposes, this explanation works. But the desert keeps older records than papyrus. Walk into the Sphinx enclosure and examine the limestone walls that surround the monument. The stone is not smooth. It is not pocked by wind and sand. It is carved with deep, vertical channels, the unmistakable mark of water runoff. Heavy, sustained rainfall over centuries. The last time North Africa experienced that kind of climate was during the African humid period, which ended around 5000 BC, thousands of years before Egypt's fourth dynasty existed. Geologists have documented this. The erosion patterns are real. The debate is not whether the weathering exists, but what it means. Step inside the Great Pyramid, and you will find something equally strange. Nothing. No wall paintings, no funerary prayers, no hieroglyphs naming the deceased, no golden treasures or ritual offerings, only bare granite chambers, narrow passages, and a massive stone box without a lid, without inscriptions, without explanation. Every confirmed royal tomb in Egypt follows a pattern. Decorated walls, religious texts, symbolic art, the name of the pharaoh carved into stone. The Great Pyramid contains none of this. It breaks the template so completely that Egyptologists have spent generations explaining why this particular tomb is the exception. And then there are the texts the Egyptians themselves were left behind. The Inventory Stela, housed in the Egyptian Museum, describes Khufu not as the pyramid's architect, but as someone who restored structures already standing at Giza. The Dream Stela, placed between the Sphinx's paws by Thutmose IV, speaks of excavating the monument from sand, as though it had been buried and forgotten long before his reign. These are not fringe artifacts. They are catalogued, translated, and accessible. They simply tell a different story than the one we were taught. If these details are correct, if the monuments show signs of a climate Egypt's pharaohs never knew, if the Great Pyramid lacks the features of a tomb, if ancient inscriptions describe restoration rather than construction, then the timeline shifts. Not by decades, by millennia. And human history stops being a straight line from primitive beginnings to civilization. It becomes something more complex, a cycle of knowledge gained, lost, and rediscovered, monuments built, buried, and reclaimed. Civilizations that rose earlier than we believed possible, achieved precision we struggle to explain, and left behind structures designed to outlast memory itself. This is not a story about aliens or lost continents. It is a story about evidence, geological, architectural, textual, that refuses to fit comfortably into the narrative we've inherited. Evidence scattered across disciplines that rarely communicate, geology that reads climate in stone, archaeology that measures precision in alignment, linguistics that translates the words of people who may have been describing something they themselves did not fully understand. Piece by piece, these fragments assemble into a question that will not go away. Tonight, we follow that question where it leads. Through erosion patterns and absent inscriptions, through ancient texts and sealed chambers, through mathematics encoded in stone and climates recorded in bedrock. We will examine what mainstream archaeology explains and what it struggles to explain. We will listen to what the monuments say when we stop assuming we already know their story. Each chapter will circle back to the same possibility, that the pyramids may be older, stranger, and more deliberate than a single dynasty's ambition, not because we want them to be mysterious, but because the evidence keeps insisting they are. The sky darkens. The last light fades from the plateau. Stars appear in the clarity of desert air. The pyramids stand as they have always stood, silent, precise, aligned with a sky. Egypt's fourth dynasty mapped, but may not have been the first to know. The Sphinx gazes east, toward the horizon, where the sun will rise again in a few hours, just as it has for thousands of years. Perhaps longer than we have been willing to count. And beneath the sand, beneath the stone, beneath the certainty of textbooks and tour guides, the question waits. How much of human history remains buried, waiting patiently beneath the ground we think we've already explored? The land itself remembers, written in erosion, in absence, in the words of those who came after and called these monuments ancient even then. And the first thing the land remembers is rain. Between 10,000 and 5,000 BC, the Sahara was not a desert. Geological cores extracted from lake beds across North Africa confirm what seems impossible now. This region once received seasonal monsoons, rivers carved through what is now sand, grasslands stretched across plateaus where today nothing grows, hippos waded in lakes that have been dry for 7,000 years. This was the African humid period, a climate so different from modern Egypt that standing on the Giza plateau then would have meant standing beneath rain. The evidence is not theoretical. Pollen samples, sediment layers, and fossilized riverbeds all point to the same conclusion. North Africa was wet, green, and capable of supporting life in ways the current desert cannot. And if the Sphinx was already standing during this period, exposed to centuries of rainfall, then the erosion makes sense. But that would place the monument's origin thousands of years before the pharaohs. Some geologists have noted this. In peer-reviewed studies, they describe the weathering patterns in the Sphinx enclosure as inconsistent with 4,500 years of wind and sand. The vertical channels suggest water runoff, prolonged, heavy, seasonal. The kind that requires a climate Egypt has not experienced since long before writing, before cities, before the Nile settled into its current course. Mainstream Egyptology offers explanations, variations in limestone density, localized flooding, or unique weathering conditions specific to the enclosure. These are reasonable responses. Geology is complex. Stone does not always behave predictably. But the question does not disappear. If the Sphinx bears marks of a climate that ended millennia before Khafra's reign, then either the weathering interpretations are wrong, or the monument is far older than its attributed construction date. What kind of world existed here when these stones were new? Wind erosion creates horizontal striations, layers of abraded stone where sand particles strike repeatedly at the same height, driven by prevailing currents. Water erosion creates vertical channels, grooves that follow gravity, carved by runoff flowing downward over centuries. The Sphinx enclosure displays the second pattern. Stand inside the rectangular pit surrounding the monument, and the limestone walls rise several meters on all sides. The surface is not smooth. Deep, rounded grooves run vertically down the stone, widening near the top where water would have pooled before cascading downward. These are not shallow scratches. They penetrate the bedrock in ways that require sustained exposure, not occasional flooding, but regular seasonal rainfall over extended periods. Geologist Robert Schoch conducted field studies of the enclosure in the early 1990s. His analysis, published in peer-reviewed journals, concluded that the weathering patterns were inconsistent with the 4,500-year timeline attributed to the Sphinx. He proposed that the monument had been exposed to significant precipitation, rainfall that has not occurred in this region since the end of the African humid period, around 5000 BC. Orthodox Egyptology responded with alternative explanations, that the limestone's varying hardness created irregular erosion, that groundwater seepage could produce similar effects, or that the enclosure's microclimate behaved unpredictably. These are valid geological considerations. Stone weathers in complex ways. Local conditions matter, but the debate itself is significant. It is not fringe speculation. It is published, peer-reviewed, and unresolved. If the erosion truly reflects a wetter climate, then the Sphinx was carved when the desert was still green. Not during Egypt's 4th dynasty. Not during any dynasty at all. But stone alone doesn't tell the whole story. Sometimes the builders speak for themselves. What did the ancient Egyptians themselves say about these monuments? The inventory. Stela sits catalogued in the Egyptian Museum, translated, accessible, and largely dismissed. It dates to the 26th dynasty, more than 2,000 years after Khufu's reign. But its inscription describes something unexpected. Khufu discovering the Great Pyramid, and Sphinx already standing at Giza, not building them, not commissioning them, restoring them. The text uses language of repair, clearing sand, reinforcing stonework, preserving what was already ancient. It places the monuments in a timeline where they predate the pharaoh credited with their construction. Mainstream Egyptology considers the stela a later fabrication, a piece of nationalist mythology created during a period when Egypt sought to reclaim its past glories by attributing greater antiquity to its monuments. This explanation is reasonable. Political motives shape historical records. Later dynasties often rewrote earlier achievements to suit contemporary narratives. But the Dream Stela tells a similar story. Erected by Thutmose IV between the Sphinx's paws, it describes the monument buried to its shoulders in sand. Forgotten, neglected, requiring excavation. The text frames Thutmose not as a builder, but as a restorer, someone who cleared away what centuries had covered. The inscription speaks of the Sphinx as though it had been standing for ages unknown, already ancient when Thutmose arrived. These are not obscure documents. They are prominent, translated, and repeatedly cited. Yet, their implications are treated as symbolic rather than literal. Why would multiple dynasties describe these monuments as inheritances rather than creations? Why use the language of restoration instead of construction? Perhaps because they were describing what they found, not what they built. Yet, even if the Egyptians restored them, inherited them, revered them as relics from an earlier time, what were these structures meant to be? Why does the Great Pyramid not resemble a tomb at all? Every confirmed pharaonic tomb in Egypt follows a pattern. The walls are covered in hieroglyphic prayers, spells from the pyramid texts or Book of the Dead, designed to guide the deceased through the afterlife. Images of gods line the corridors. The pharaoh's name is carved repeatedly, ensuring his identity endures. Canopic jars hold preserved organs. Sarcophagi bear inscriptions. Treasures fill burial chambers, furniture, jewelry, offerings for eternity. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings display this. The mastabas at Saqqara display this. Even earlier royal burials, crude by comparison, contain ritual objects and symbolic art. The Great Pyramid contains none of it. Walk through its passages and you will find bare stone, no paintings, no prayers, no hieroglyphs. The chambers are empty granite rooms with precise angles and acoustics that resonate at specific frequencies, properties that serve no funerary purpose. In the king's chamber sits a granite box, often called a sarcophagus, but it has no lid, no inscriptions. Its interior dimensions are too small for a standard burial, yet its walls are thicker than necessary for structural support. It was carved from a single block of Aswan granite, hollowed with a precision that required tools capable of sustained, controlled cutting through one of the hardest stones available. Egyptologists explain this as an early or unfinished burial, a prototype before later dynasties perfected tomb decoration. Perhaps Khufu's burial was looted so thoroughly that all traces vanished. Perhaps the pyramid's function evolved after construction began. These explanations are possible, but they require assuming that Egypt's most ambitious architectural project broke every funerary convention without leaving a single clue why. But the questions don't end in the chambers we can see. What lies in the spaces we have not yet explored? In 1993, a German robotics engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small crawler into one of the Great Pyramid's narrow shafts. Passages too small for humans, ascending at steep angles from the Queen's chamber. The robot traveled 65 meters before its camera detected an obstruction. A limestone block fitted with 2 copper pins, sealing the shaft completely. It was not debris. It was not collapse. It was a door, deliberately placed, precisely fitted, with metal fixtures that served no structural purpose. Behind it, ground-penetrating radar suggested empty space. 9 years later, a drill bored through the block. The camera pushed forward into darkness and found a second door. Same limestone, same copper fittings, same deliberate construction. Exploration stopped. The Egyptian authorities restricted further access, citing preservation concerns and structural risk. The shafts remain sealed. The spaces beyond the second door have never been entered. What lies further inside is unknown, not because the technology doesn't exist, but because permission to explore has not been granted. This is not conspiracy. It is bureaucracy, preservation policy, and the reality that invasive exploration risks damaging what it seeks to understand. But it leaves the question suspended. What was sealed inside the pyramid, and why? In 2017, muon tomography, a non-invasive imaging technique using cosmic rays, revealed a large void above the Grand Gallery. The chamber is at least 30 meters long, with a cross-section similar to the gallery below it. Its purpose is unknown. Its contents are unknown. It remains inaccessible. Beneath the Sphinx, ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys have detected anomalies, rectangular cavities, voids, possible chambers carved into bedrock. Some researchers have proposed these could be natural fissures. Others suggest they are artificial. Without excavation, the truth remains buried. But excavation is not permitted. The Sphinx Plateau is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Drilling, tunneling, or invasive exploration requires approval from multiple governmental and archaeological bodies. Proposals have been submitted and denied. The risks, structural damage, groundwater infiltration, political controversy outweigh the potential discoveries in the eyes of those who control access. So the voids remain sealed, the doors remain closed, and the pyramid continues to hold spaces that modern technology can detect but not enter. The structure was not fully explored when it was first opened. It is not fully explored now. And the longer these spaces remain inaccessible, the more their silence weighs against the assumption that the pyramid has already revealed everything it contains. Yet, Giza is not the only place where history arrived earlier than expected. What happens when Egypt is placed into a global context? Göbekli Tepe was built 11,600 years ago, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids, and thousands of years before agriculture, pottery, or permanent settlements. Yet, it required organization, planning, skilled labor coordinating across distances. The site consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, some weighing up to 16 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, serpents, scorpions, vultures. The builders had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. They were, according to the previous understanding of human development, hunter-gatherers. But hunter-gatherers do not build monuments. Göbekli Tepe was discovered in southern Turkey in 1994. Radiocarbon dating confirmed its age repeatedly. Archaeologists initially struggled to explain how a pre-agricultural society could mobilize the resources, labor, and knowledge required for such construction. The timeline didn't fit. The capabilities didn't match the era. And then it was deliberately buried. Around 8000 BC, the entire complex was filled in with soil and rubble, covering the pillars completely. Not destroyed, preserved, hidden beneath the earth for millennia, as though whoever built it wanted it to survive beyond their time. This was not an isolated anomaly. In Malta, the Hal Saflieni hypogeum descends 3 levels into solid limestone bedrock, carved entirely by hand over 5,000 years ago. Its chambers display acoustic properties that amplify specific frequencies. Intentional design, not accident. The walls are smooth, precise, shaped with techniques that remain difficult to replicate, even with modern tools. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the foundation stones of the ancient temple platform include blocks weighing over 800 tons, among the largest worked stones ever moved by humans. They were quarried, transported, and fitted with such precision that no mortar was needed. The joints are nearly seamless. How they were moved remains unresolved, even with modern engineering analysis. These sites span continents and millennia, yet they share common features: precision beyond what their eras supposedly allowed, organizational complexity that contradicts developmental timelines, and construction techniques that modern archaeology struggles to fully explain. They force a reconsideration. Human societies may have been more organized, more knowledgeable, and more capable far earlier than historians once believed. The progression from primitive to advanced was not as linear as textbooks suggested. Egypt, in this context, is not an outlier. It is part of a pattern, one where monumental construction appears earlier and more sophisticated than the traditional narrative accommodates. But if civilizations rose earlier, achieved precision we struggle to replicate, and left monuments designed to endure, why do we remember so little? What erases entire chapters of human history? Between 14,000 and 11,700 years ago, global sea levels rose by more than 120 meters. Not gradually, not evenly. In surges, rapid, catastrophic flooding events driven by collapsing ice sheets as the last ice age ended. Coastlines where humans had lived for millennia vanished beneath the ocean. River valleys became bays. Islands disappeared. Entire landscapes were submerged, and with them, any settlements, artifacts, or evidence of the societies that had inhabited them. This is not speculation. It is geology. Ice core data, sediment layers, and submerged shoreline features confirm the timeline. The flooding was real, widespread, and devastating to any coastal populations. And most early human settlements were coastal. Rivers provided fresh water, fish, and transportation. Coastlines offered abundant resources and moderate climates. If advanced societies existed before the flood, their remains now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, inaccessible, unexcavated, invisible to most archaeological surveys. What we call the beginning of civilization may simply be the point where societies moved inland and left traces we can still reach. But flooding was not the only reset. The Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate cooling lasting from 12,800 to 11,700 years ago, brought severe droughts, temperature swings, and ecological collapse across much of the inhabited world. Agricultural communities that had begun to develop faltered. Populations migrated or collapsed. Knowledge systems dependent on oral transmission fragmented as groups scattered. When stability returned, much of what had been known was gone. Oral traditions preserve stories, but they distort over generations. Details become metaphor. Chronology blurs. Events merge. Without writing, knowledge must be passed directly from person to person, and each transmission risks loss. A single generation's disruption, war, famine, migration, can sever the chain entirely. Written records survive better, but only if the material endures. Papyrus decays. Clay tablets shatter, parchment burns, libraries are destroyed in conquest, neglect, or accident. The Library of Alexandria held centuries of accumulated knowledge, and it burned. What was lost remains unknown, because the records of what it contained were also destroyed. Stone, however, does not burn. It does not decay. It does not rely on continuous cultural transmission to persist. Monuments built in stone can survive the collapse of the civilizations that created them. They outlast languages, religions, political systems, and memory itself. They become artifacts without context, structures whose origins are forgotten but whose presence cannot be erased. Göbekli Tepe was buried deliberately and survived 11,000 years. The pyramids have stood through empires, invasions, climate shifts, and the complete transformation of the cultures surrounding them. They were built to endure not decades or centuries, but millennia. Perhaps they were built knowing that everything else would be lost. And yet, some knowledge may have been deliberately preserved, not in text, but in dimension, alignment, and material. Information encoded in ways that do not require language to transmit. The Great Pyramid's dimensions reflect the Earth's proportions. Its alignment tracks celestial movements with precision that requires long-term astronomical observation. Its construction demonstrates knowledge of geometry, engineering, and logistics, far beyond what simple survival requires. If a society knew catastrophe was coming, if they understood that memory fades, records burn, and coastlines vanish, how would they preserve what mattered most? Not in words. Words change, fade, are mistranslated and forgotten. In stone, in mathematics, in structures too massive to be moved, too precise to be accidental, too durable to be destroyed by anything less than intentional demolition. What if the pyramids were designed to outlast civilization itself? The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree. this is not approximate. It is not close enough for ancient standards. It is precise by modern surveying benchmarks, more accurate than the Greenwich Observatory when it was first built in 1675. Achieving this required observing stellar positions over extended periods, compensating for atmospheric refraction, and understanding that the Earth's axis shifts slowly over millennia. The structure encodes mathematical relationships that appear repeatedly. The ratio of its height to its perimeter approximates 2 pi. The dimensions reflect the Earth's polar radius when scaled by 43,200. The chambers and passages align with specific stars: Sirius, Orion's belt, Alpha Draconis, positions that change over thousands of years due to precession. These are not coincidences piled carelessly atop one another. They are intentional features embedded in a structure built with 2.3 million blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, fitted so precisely that a blade cannot slide between many of the joints. The scale alone suggests permanence. The precision suggests purpose. And the durability, 4.5 millennia at minimum, possibly far longer, suggests a structure designed not for a single pharaoh's afterlife, but for deep time. Compare this with the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, built 1,500 years after the pyramids. Those tombs are decorated, inscribed, and designed to be sealed forever. They were not meant to be entered again. They were not meant to communicate with future generations. They were private, sacred, hidden. The Great Pyramid was never hidden. It has always been visible, massive, unavoidable. Its passages were accessible long before modern archaeology arrived. Its dimensions could be measured by anyone with basic tools. Its alignments could be verified by anyone who watched the stars. It is not a secret. It is a statement, carved in stone, oriented to the heavens, built to endure the collapse of the civilization that claimed it. And Egypt did claim it. Dynasties restored the pyramids, cleared the sand, repaired the casing stones. Pharaohs left inscriptions describing their efforts to preserve what was already ancient. They revered these monuments not as their own achievements, but as inheritances, sacred, powerful, essential to their identity. Perhaps because they understood something we have forgotten, that knowledge does not survive in texts alone. Books burn, languages die, empires fall, but stone remains. And if knowledge must survive catastrophe, it must be encoded in forms that do not rely on cultural continuity. Mathematics persists across cultures. Geometry needs no translation. Astronomical alignments can be observed by any society with clear skies and patience. Dimensions can be measured. Proportions can be studied. The information is there, waiting, independent of whoever built it and whoever finds it later. This does not require advanced technology. It requires advanced understanding of cycles, time, preservation, and what endures. The pyramids may not be evidence of a lost super-civilization with flying machines and energy crystals. They may be evidence of something more profound, that human knowledge developed earlier than we believed, was organized with long-term purpose, and understood that memory is fragile. They may represent a deliberate effort to preserve what could not be preserved any other way. Not the achievements of a single dynasty, but the accumulated knowledge of generations, encoded in alignment, dimension, and material, passed down not through writing, but through structure, restored across centuries by people who no longer remembered the original purpose, but recognized the significance. Egypt as steward, not originator. Caretaker of monuments they inherited and struggled to understand, yet preserved, because something in their design demanded preservation. But even this realization leaves one final question, not about the pyramids, but about us. What does this mean for how we understand ourselves? History is not a finished text. It is a living investigation, revised with every discovery, rewritten with every new technology, reconsidered with every question that refuses to fade. 50 years ago, radiocarbon dating transformed archaeology. Sites once assumed to be recent were revealed as ancient. Chronologies shifted by millennia. Göbekli Tepe had not yet been excavated. The idea that hunter-gatherers built monumental structures was dismissed as impossible. Now it is documented fact. Ground-penetrating radar, muon tomography, LiDAR scanning, these tools have revealed hidden chambers, submerged cities, and structures buried beneath jungle canopy that were invisible to previous generations. What seemed empty is full. What seemed natural is artificial. What seemed understood is suddenly uncertain. The same will happen with the pyramids. Technology will improve. Access restrictions may change. New discoveries will emerge, perhaps from the sealed shafts, perhaps from the voids detected but not yet explored, perhaps from beneath the Sphinx, where anomalies remain unexcavated. And when those discoveries arrive, they will not resolve the mystery. They will deepen it. Because every answer in archaeology generates more questions. Every chamber opened reveals another passage. Every text translated references older texts now lost. This is not failure. This is how knowledge works. The pyramids do not demand belief. They do not require us to abandon mainstream Egyptology or embrace fringe theories. They simply ask us to remain curious, to recognize that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that precision does not require advanced technology, but does require advanced knowledge, and that monuments built to endure deep time may contain purposes we have not yet considered. The erosion on the Sphinx may reflect water. It may reflect geological variation. Both possibilities remain open. The debate continues. The Great Pyramid may have been Khufu's tomb, built exactly when tradition claims. It may have been an older structure he restored and claimed. Both explanations fit some evidence and struggle with other details. The sealed doors, the hidden voids, the inscriptions describing restoration. these are not proof of anything except incompleteness. The story is not finished. The evidence is still emerging, and the monuments themselves remain patient, outlasting every certainty we try to impose upon them. History is full of monuments whose original purposes were forgotten. Stonehenge stood for 3,000 years before anyone tried to understand its alignments. The Parthenon became a church, then a mosque, then a ruin. Göbekli Tepe was buried deliberately and lost for 11 millennia. Meaning is not permanent. Context erodes faster than stone, and civilizations that inherit monuments they did not build often reinterpret them, projecting their own beliefs, adapting the structures to new purposes, claiming ownership of what they found rather than what they made. Perhaps this is what Egypt did. Perhaps the pyramids were already ancient when the first dynasty formed, already weathered by rains that had stopped falling millennia before, already aligned to stars in configurations the Egyptians recorded but did not originate. Perhaps they became tombs, not because they were built as tombs, but because Egypt needed to make sense of structures they could not explain, and tombs were the closest concept they had. Or perhaps they were built exactly as tradition claims, by Khufu's engineers, with 4th dynasty tools for 4th dynasty purposes. And the anomalies, the erosion, the precision, the absence of inscriptions, are explainable through geology, craftsmanship, and looting we cannot fully trace. Both narratives remain possible. The evidence supports questions more than answers. And that is the point. The pyramids are not puzzles designed to be solved. They are witnesses to time itself, built by someone, for purposes that may have shifted across centuries, surviving long past the point where their origins could be documented with certainty. They do not prove a lost civilization. They prove that human knowledge is older, more fragmented, and more resilient than we often acknowledge. That catastrophe erases more than it preserves. That stone remembers what papyrus forgets. That structures can outlast the memory of their creation and still carry meaning forward, encoded in dimension, alignment, and sheer endurance. Night has returned to the Giza plateau. The last tourists have gone. The floodlights dim. The temperature drops, and the desert wind moves quietly across stone that has felt this same wind for millennia. The pyramids stand in darkness, their edges sharp against the stars. The Sphinx crouches, half buried as it has been so many times before, patient as always. The sand shifts slowly around the foundations. The limestone cools, the shadows deepen, and in the stillness, something persists that cannot be measured or catalogued or explained away by any single theory, not mystery for its own sake, not secrets hidden by ancient conspiracies. Simply this: the monuments remain longer than our certainty about them. They were here before us. They will be here after. And every generation that encounters them must decide whether to adapt the inherited story or to look again, carefully, skeptically, openly, at what the stones themselves might still be saying. History is not settled. It is unfolding. The pyramids remain, silent, patient, older than certainty itself.